In the age of Viking glory, the North ruled the waves. But beneath those same waters, a shadow stirred, a people the sagas barely whispered about. Slavic warriors who struck from the fog, raided the raiders, and vanished without a trace. They called them the Wends, and even the Vikings feared their sails. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll know how a forgotten Slavic people rose from obscurity to challenge the very masters of the sea, and why their name disappeared from history almost as quickly as it appeared. They were not one people, but many. A confederation of Slavic tribes who settled along the southern Baltic coast, lands that today stretch across northern Germany and Poland. To the north lay the Danes and Swedes, to the west, the Franks, and in between, the Wends, fierce, independent, and endlessly raided by Vikings until they learned to fight back. The Norse called their homeland Vendland, a borderland of storms and marshes, a place of trade and ambush. But who were they really? Farmers turned fighters? Or pirates wearing Slavic masks? To answer that, we need to go back to when the Wends first rose from the ruins of the Roman world. After Rome's collapse, waves of Slavic peoples moved into the forests and rivers of Central Europe. Among them were the Veneti, the ancient ancestors of the Wends. They spread westward, filling the power vacuum left by retreating Germanic tribes. They built wooden hill forts, cleared forests, and raised villages by the water's edge. But isolation bred defiance. Between the Elbe and the Oder, these new tribes became hardened survivors, hemmed in by enemies, united by threat. And when the first Norse ships appeared on their coasts, the Wends were ready. Not yet pirates, not yet legends, but ready to learn. Each tribe, Obodrites, Veliti, Liutisi, Rugians, ruled its own small world. Wooden strongholds called gords rose above rivers and lakes, each ringed by palisades and watchtowers. Their rulers were chosen from warrior elites. Trade routes flowed through their lands, amber, furs, slaves. But wealth drew predators. The Vikings came first as merchants, then as conquerors. The Danes demanded tribute. The Swedes raided Wendish coasts. And yet, in those raids, the Wends learned something vital. They studied the longships, they studied the tactics, and soon they built fleets of their own. The Norse sagas remember them, barely, but vividly. In the Heimskringla and Hakon's saga, the Wends appear as both foe and friend, an enigma along the stormy southern edge of the Baltic. To the Northmen, Wendland was a place of shifting loyalties, a land of mist and rumor where kings sought refuge and enemies found sanctuary. It was to these shores that King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway once fled, hunted and exiled. There, he found not only safety but love. A Wendish princess named Geira, ruler of her own coastal stronghold. Their marriage bound two worlds that had long eyed each other with suspicion. For a fleeting moment, Vikings and Wends shared more than bloodshed. They shared trade, faith, and ambition. Wendland's ports filled with Norse ships, heavy with amber and furs. Slavic craftsmen worked alongside Scandinavian traders. The sea that once divided them became a corridor of power. But alliances in the Viking Age were as fragile as oaths in the wind. When Danish power rose and Olaf's fortunes shifted, peace fractured. The same ports that had welcomed his fleet became targets. Danish kings demanded tribute. Norwegian warlords raided the coast. The Wends endured for a while. But when their villages burned and their temples fell, they learned a lesson that would echo for generations. Mercy was weakness. The next time the Norse came south, the Wends did not wait behind their walls. They built their own ships. They learned to fight on the sea. And when the longships returned, they met fire with fire. From that moment on, the Baltic would never belong to the Vikings alone. By the 10th century, the Wends had mastered the art of the sea. They struck from hidden inlets, moving swift and silent in long, narrow ships of their own design. To the Danes, they were pirates. To themselves, they were avengers. Wendish fleets raided Danish islands, burned coastal settlements, and ambushed trading vessels. They fought like shadows, fast, coordinated, and merciless. For the first time, the fear that Vikings had once spread across Europe began to echo back across the Baltic. The raiders had become the raided. But even as Wendish sails multiplied, a new threat was rising. Not from the sea, but from the empire to the south. In 983, the Wends rose up, a rare and furious rebellion against the Holy Roman Empire. They struck with precision, burning churches, toppling garrisons, and driving German settlers out of their lands. For a moment, the Slavic coast was free again, wild, pagan, and defiant. But empires have long memories. And in 1147, vengeance returned under a new banner, the Wendish Crusade. It was called a holy mission to bring Christianity to the pagans. But in truth, it was a campaign of steel and scripture, cloaked in faith, driven by conquest. German knights, Danish kings, and Polish lords marched together, an alliance bound not by belief, but by greed. Wendish villages were burned, sacred groves desecrated, survivors chained and sold. Yet even in defeat, their spirit refused to die. When the Crusaders thought the coast was pacified, one fortress still stood, Arkona on the island of Rügen. A towering temple fortress devoted to the god Svantovit, its white walls shone like bone against the sea. It would become the last beacon of Wendish defiance and the stage for their final stand. Arkona was the last stronghold of Wendish resistance, a temple fortress to the god Svantovit perched high above the Baltic cliffs. When the Danes came in 1168, led by King Valdemar I, they demanded surrender. The Wends refused. The siege was brutal. Fire consumed the ramparts, and when the temple of Svantovit fell, the priests were slaughtered, their idols shattered. The last voice of pagan Wendland was silenced, but not forgotten. If you're enjoying uncovering the hidden side of Viking history, the stories the sagas left out, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps us bring forgotten civilizations like the Wends back into the light. Now, let's see what survived after the flames. Though their temples fell, the Wends never fully disappeared. Their blood flowed into new generations, their names lingered in the soil. Across northern Germany, countless towns still bear their mark. Au, Itz, In, echoes of Slavic tongues. One Wendish people, the Sorbs, survived in the heart of eastern Germany. They still speak their language today, a living fragment of a nation erased by crusade and conquest. But even as their culture endured in whispers, the memory of the Wends became a symbol of power. For centuries after their disappearance, the name of the Wends refused to fade. Scandinavian and German kings continued to style themselves King of the Wends, a title once meant to declare dominance, later worn as a symbol of old terror and prestige. It was less a claim to land and more a claim to memory. To bear the title was to boast that you had conquered the ghosts of the Baltic, that you had tamed the wild pagan tribes who once defied both empire and cross. But time distorts truth. The Wends who once defended their coasts became branded as pirates. Their shrines became idols, their freedom, rebellion. And so the victors wrote the story, casting the Wends as the savages they had conquered. Yet history whispers another tale, that these so-called pirates were mariners of defiance, clinging to sovereignty in a sea ruled by crusaders. Their legacy lingers not just in royal titles, but in the uneasy reverence of those who claim to have erased them. To understand them, we must strip away the myths and look unflinchingly at what remains beneath. The sources that mention the Wends come mostly from their enemies, Norse sagas, German chronicles, crusader accounts, and every one of them had an agenda. To the Norse, they were rivals. To the Germans, heathens. To the church, pagans to be saved or slain. Modern historians now see them differently, as part of a complex Baltic world where cultures clashed, traded, and merged. Their piracy, their wars, were not acts of savagery, but survival in an age of conquest. And that makes their story all the more haunting. Because if the Wends could terrify Vikings, what kind of world did they live in? It wasn't just their ships or their swords. It was the unpredictability, the sudden raids, the uncanny familiarity with the sea. The Vikings had long believed themselves masters of the Baltic, but the Wends shattered that illusion. They were the mirror image of the Norse, born of the same storms, driven by the same hunger. They knew the sea's secrets, its inlets and currents, and they turned the Viking art of fear back upon its creators. That's why the sagas remembered them not as victims, but as equals. Today, the name Wend has faded from maps, but their story lingers in the landscape, in languages, in myths, in the DNA of nations that forgot them. They were proof that even the most feared conquerors could be conquered in turn, that the tide of power, like the sea itself, never stays still. The Wends remind us of a truth history often hides, that every empire has its shadows, and every conqueror meets their reflection. If you enjoyed this journey into the forgotten wars of the Baltic, don't let it end here. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story waiting in the dark. Up next, click the video on your screen to discover the queen who orchestrated witch hunts. Until next time, remember, history is written by the victors, but whispered by the vanished.